Hello to my Theosophical buddies. This is Jeff Curtis coming to you once again from the Sierra foothills. And I am happy to be with you. I wish I could see some of you in person. We're going to do this remotely again. So, the topic I want to address tonight is to sort of begin what I think will probably be more than one presentation on this concept of self and how we might define that and what self might mean in a few different points of view. Now, obviously, this is very closely related to the question of consciousness and or self-awareness. And so reading in this area tends to be very much overlapping and a sort of a certain amount of redundancy, and some of the things I'll be talking about here tonight will sound familiar to you from other talks I've given on the topic of consciousness. Limiting our discussion to definitions of and proposed definitions of self narrows the discussion enough to make it a little bit more interesting. It's both more constrained, but it also allows me to be a little bit more exact. So before I get all the way into that topic, I want to mention two little news items that came out sort of interesting to my mind just in the last few days, or actually last couple months. And you'll remember that I sometimes do that. I kind of comb my various magazines, the two most important ones being Scientific American and a weekly magazine called The New Scientist. An interesting story in second to the last Scientific American has to do with metacognition in chimpanzees. So to me, an endlessly fascinating topic is that signs of conscious awareness and conscious processing in animals. I find that to be just interesting at a bunch of different levels, and it's very interesting from the point of view of consciousness science. So I'm going to go through this fairly briefly, but some experimenters working with chimpanzees recently figured out very intelligent experimental design that allows them to infer a state of knowledge and thinking going on in chimpanzees. So what they did was they trained these chimpanzees how to solve a certain food finding puzzle, and they learned a set of rules, and they could be either better or less good at finding food given a certain puzzle circumstance. But then what they did that was so interesting is they found a way to slip in little hints right at the beginning phase of this test or this problem-solving session for a given chimpanzee that would provide a hint as to a possible rule change in the game that they're playing. So not all, but some of the chimps caught that hint, rearranged their mental map of how they thought the game worked and where the most likely place to find the food was going to be, and on the first try changed their behavior and found the food better than they would have otherwise by using this new hint, this new cue. This is very interesting and important from the standpoint of consciousness science. To put fancy words to it, this is an example of something we call updating of Bayesian priors. So if you have prior beliefs as to the probability of outcomes and where you're going to find food or whatever it is you're looking for, but a new piece of information comes in that would change your prior assumptions and your prior sense of how this game was working, that's actually that's considered to be a sign of what we call metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. So those chimps who caught the hint and changed their behavior were alert enough to infer a new landscape. Not all of them were. I'm guessing it would have been the smarter ones, but who knows? How do you measure that? This might be the way you measure that. So kind of a big deal. Now, you might have noticed that the story of the history of the science of consciousness means finding higher levels of consciousness than we expected in more places than we expected, like passing the mirror test, which now I think there's at least 10 animals who have passed it. That's fascinating. And it's important, too, because it guides scientists in the field, it guides ethicists, it guides neurologists, guides doctors. The more we know about the state of consciousness existing in an individual person or animal's head, the better decisions we can make. So that's a cool one. The second one I wanted to mention is sort of even more surprising. So somebody somewhere reported in the New Scientist magazine got around to doing very careful observations and essentially neurological probing experiments on jellyfish. Now, jellyfish, very ancient form of life, there's thought to have been 2 times when 2 different forms of nervous system first began to appear, organizations of what is arguably acting like neural tissue. And so one of them went on to kind of win the race and be the ancestor of most living jellyfish today, but not all. So they were doing experiments with these jellyfish and recording what was going on in their tendrils of quasi-nervous tissue, which drives pulsings. So if you've ever been close enough to a jellyfish swimming around or looked at one in an aquarium, you might notice that they sort of pulse. It's kind of how they move through the water. It's also how they cycle water through their tentacles and acquire food. So this particular kind of jellyfish was, I guess, maybe easier to study than some. Its typical lifestyle is to lay on its back with its feet and tentacles going up in shallow parts of a coral reef and just pulse as a way to bring nutrients and food down to itself. They did sufficiently refined experiments to realize that these jellyfish were sleeping for about 8 hours a day. So approximately a third of their life, just like us, is spent sleeping. They would judge that by noting that the pulsation rate would drop way down and their response to either a bright light or food would become dampened and slower. So they inferred from this that the jellyfish is asleep. We have to present something kind of big to wake them up. And the jellyfish nap for about an hour a day, which is fascinating. And if you disturb their sleep at night by flashing lights at them or hassling them or whatever, they take more naps during the day. And so, my goodness, doesn't that sound familiar? We could use the idea of the jellyfish to get into a discussion of what constitutes consciousness, self-awareness, a sense of self. I don't want to quite do that at this moment, but you can see how it's a very interesting tie-in to some big questions about how we're going to think about and define things. And it's fascinating to find this need for sleep in organisms as so much older than us, back in the dawn of time, just beginning to develop nervous systems. They already have this need. It hasn't been explained. At least I haven't yet read a good explanation for just what's happening for those jellyfish to maintain themselves and reset themselves when they're asleep. But I'm sure that'll be coming out. Okay, so on to our topic for the day. There's a couple of different directions I can come at the topic of self from. And one of them, the one I want to go into first, would be what you might call the top-down or the top-level type of discussion, where we'd be considering the nature of self from a psychological and then perhaps, and for right now, more of a spiritual and theological point of view, because There are a couple of interesting and competing big bodies of thought on this topic. What I want to just pick out and mention right now would be sort of two of the main ones, which would be the Hindu philosophy idea of Atman, and then coming along later in history and having a rich history of its own, the Buddhist idea of Anatman. Now, I'm going to summarize them pretty quickly here because time flies when I'm doing these discussions. So please forgive me if I oversimplify this according to your taste. There's actually a lot of debate that swirls around this topic. So if we think about the Hindu approach to the idea of self and Atman, we come to realize that that discussion is couched in terms of an eternal unit of Brahman, the ultimate, all-inclusive ground level of reality. And in the Hindu point of view, you might approximately call Atman in this context, make it equivalent to soul. Although in my reading I came to appreciate that adherents of Advaita Vedanta would not like that so much. There would be objections to equating Atman with soul. Not going to go very far on that. And then there's an idea of progress and perfection over lifetimes and learning the lessons of karma and understanding what constitutes meritorious action leading to progress and delusional action leading to trouble. And over eons of however long it takes, there's the notion of realization on the part of an individual Atman, sometimes called a Jivatman, of its fundamental unity with the larger whole, Brahman. And in that realization comes reunification and dissolution back into the whole. It's a very beautiful idea, and it's rich if you follow it out. It gets along in some interesting ways with modern science. It talks about the length of a day of Brahma, and there's fascinating details regarding cycles of time and incarnation. And I think it's sort of more familiar to Westerners because it resonates somewhat, at least, with the Judeo-Christian idea of the soul. And there's a lot to like about it. Okay, so along comes Buddha in about 500 BC, and he taught something different, relevant to the Atman. He came to the conclusion that there is no permanent Atman. There's no thing that persists. His ideas were pervaded and taught at the time and percolated for a long time. Then in about 200 AD, Nagarjuna came along. He was a brilliant scholar and writer and influencer of the day. And he very much developed the idea of Anatman and came up with a schema for the nature of the self. And to put it kind of, sort of too quickly probably, the idea here is that there's no eternal, unchanging self or soul entity or something we might refer to using a noun. It's really better to think of the self as a process, a temporary process that depends on conditions and circumstances, dependently arising apparent self navigating its way through the world, but it's not something that we're going to ascribe eternal qualities to. Furthermore, then, in this Buddhist point of view, realizing this non-absolute, non-eternal, non-fundamental nature of the thing we are experiencing as a self is key to the process of liberation, because in that realization we can be liberated by eating deep the fact that all the suffering and craving and likes and dislikes and advancing toward and repelling from the whole drama is exhausting and distracting, and it's keeping us from the ultimate nature of reality. And if we lay down the burden of all that craving and suffering and liking and disliking, there awaits liberation. Quite a concept. You can see why it caught on. Although I will say that it is rather intimidating. If you stop and let that in very far, you definitely don't get the same kind of reassuring, warm fuzzies that you get by thinking of the more Hindu concept of the soul. The Buddhist one is demanding of the person who is going to contemplate it and tread that path. Now, various Buddhist cultures and schools sort of arrive at compromise versions of this where, there really is still such a thing as reincarnation. There's bundles of karmic relationships and the 5 skandhas that do reincarnate and hold together over some period of time. And so there's diversity in the rigidity that Buddhists bring to this idea. I would say that for myself, this is just me, my own personal take and response at this juncture, is that as I'm glad there's theologians out there who care about this and want to think hard about it and debate ideas back and forth. I think that's a worthy process. For me, as sort of a very pragmatic science kind of guy, I would prefer to probably put my time into meditation and examining those experiences and examining dream experiences, because when we're lucky, when things happen right in meditation, we do get these moments of objectless awareness. And I think that's when we come closest to finding the important point, the important reality that sort of sits there in between these two theological points of view. In dreams, sometimes we can experience that calm, quiet witness that's not attached, it's not afraid, it's not judging, it's just witnessing in a very neutral way. I think there's an interesting hint there for us in addressing these questions. One of the great saints of India who I think made an important contribution to helping people along the way in considering these issues is Ramana Maharshi. And you may recall that, among other things, he's famous for having taught the who am I practice. So one sits with the question, who am I, over and over, and refines it. And of course it refines from words to an attitude, to an inner quest. And then you come up out and words again, and there's cycling back in and through. It's a demanding practice. It helps, though. And it's a lot about letting go. It's a lot about understanding the things you're not. Because if you examine them closely, you can realize, as Nagarjuna did, that these are ill-defined, with poorly defined boundaries, uh, undefinable timescales, really, and they're dependent on circumstances. And it's a big insight. So if you have never read much of Ramana Maharshi or tried that meditation, I would strongly encourage you to give it a look. There's richness there, at least in my own experience. Okay, so there we go. There's that. Now, what would be another approach to the concept of self? Well, science. Okay, so science is oftentimes accused of being overly bottom-up and or overly reductionistic in terms of breaking things apart to look at pieces and losing track of the whole. And I understand that very well. Objections to the reductionist approach of science are manifold. They've been around for a long time, and they are quite powerful and convincing. But I would say that more recent scientific progress, say in the last 30, 40 years, there has been a very rapidly increasing appreciation of integrating systems and thinking about how collections of reductionistically described and understood particles nonetheless become a new thing on their own. Meaning, for example, that no matter how much you know about an individual water molecule, you still don't have any clue about wetness unless you push your work farther, which is doable. You can do that. You can spend a lot of time doing the quantum mechanics and describing every last little detail about a water molecule and be stuck there, or you can now start throwing them together and seeing how they interact and what kinds of patterns and phenomena present themselves when you do that. And I think it's no coincidence that our ability to carry out large-scale computations with many, many bodies interacting in them came along at about the same time as our appreciation, our ability to go after interacting integrated systems theory approach to phenomena in general. Now, one of the things that this has begat is an increasing level of generalization into the possibility of space, just what might constitute a self. We're being pried away from necessarily focusing on organisms of our size and time scale who think and act like we do, and contemplating the definition of self applying to systems of biological units like the cells of a slime mold as it finds its way through a maze, for example, or even the cells of our own body as they behave and do their thing according to their genetic programming, but also sense the other cells around them and sense conditions, and then change their behavior and differentiate and maybe change even the kind of tissue that they are, depending on signals that they're getting from the ambient environment, which can include being in your own body. So this has been really something wonderful to watch evolve for me as a scientist, because it's powerful and it's far-reaching and it's exciting, and there's a lot of innovation and discovery involved with this. It's even being pushed in a whole new direction with the advent of AI and computer programs, even sometimes very simple computer programs that will surprise us with the complexity of their behavior. As I was thinking about this talk and getting my thoughts together, I realized that part of my interest in this topic and my sensitivity to it actually traces back to a very memorable experience I had once when I was about like 10 or 11 years old. And I'll just tell it to you because it's always stood out in my mind as a big deal and sort of an experiential koan that came my way by accident when I was just a kid. So I had the great good fortune as a little boy to inherit an antique microscope. This microscope had been actually utilized in my step grandfather's medical practice when he was a doctor in Boston a long time ago. This is a man I never met. I only know him by legend and reputation, but I have two artifacts that have survived through the years from him and come to me, and one was this microscope. It's antique now. It was a good microscope back in the day. And the other one is beautiful sculpture of an elephant, a little one. And I like them both. But so I inherited this microscope when I was too young to even be let near it because I was still in the realm of just breaking stuff. But then finally, at a certain point, I was given access to my microscope, and I proceeded to then pretty much torture the heck out of my family by growing jars of scummy pond water in different conditions all over the house, and I'd fish out a drop and put it on the slide and look at it and see what are all the weird stuff going on there. So I got kid level books on microbiology that I could read and appreciate. Well, this was sort of endlessly fascinating for a couple of summers in my life. At a certain point, one day I was doing that, and I came upon, this is operating at probably around 300 power, 350, which was sort of the upper quality range of that microscope's ability. I came across a little kind of round, spherical probably, but it just looked like a round disc, piece of smuts, but it had this border on it of just all this thrumming, active mass of black, wiggly hairs going on. And I had done enough microbiology to know that some of the larger microorganisms like rotifers and paramecia have cilia on their membranes, and they swim with like little paddles, these little waving hairs that wave in unison and provide a motive force. There's another kind called the euglena that has like a little tail that it whips and it can swim through the water that way. But this was something new. Had this black border of just fantastic activity going on, black wiggly stuff at a very high density, but longer and much denser than you would ever see as the cilia on the surface of a paramecium, let's say. And I was just gobsmacked. I just watched it and tried different powers and goofed with it. Finally, I found the right power and setting of the mirror, and I picked up that, whoa, that's not hair on there. That's little teeny tiny swimming spirals, little tiny organisms that are coming and hanging out for a while and then leaving. So there's this flux of barely visible. You could just barely see this by eye. They were easily visible, aggregated as a hungry, feeding horde on the surface of this thing, whatever it was. Barely visible when they would detach and swim off. But then I realized that what I was looking at was some kind of swarming behavior, feeding frenzy of a type of a microorganism called a spirochete. Spirochetes are ubiquitous in nature. They're all over the place. You prefer not to get them in you because there's some nasty diseases that come from spirochetes, including Lyme disease, for example. It's okay. I knew enough not to eat this stuff. And I remember at the time having to reevaluate my sense of what this thing was, because it impressed me so much. The activity, the size, just the juice of this thing. And then to realize, oh wait, there's little tiny units of something swimming in from off field and hanging out with thousands of its buddies, presumably long enough to eat some of this piece of food or whatever and then leave. And so I had to radically rearrange my thinking on what I was looking at and move from what seemed to be a single self of a kind of a large, weird protozoan to, oh no, I'm looking at maybe 100,000 individuals here. There were just so many and coming and going. And it put me into a state that I clearly remember pretty well, just because of the mental rearrangement I had to do. Maybe it was a little bit like one of those chimpanzees rearranging my Bayesian priors, although I certainly wouldn't have known that at the time. Now raises the question, what might be a fundamental and smallest unit of selfhood? There's multiple approaches into that question. Could be a cell. I think there's a reasonable argument to think there's something that it's like to be a protozoan. I can't say yes or no, but I can open my mind that far. Let's think about other ones, a little harder. And this would be in the category of what systems scientists call dissipative structures. Dissipative structures are natural units of organization that spring into existence when there's a strong enough gradient of something, like temperature or a chemical gradient, that a structure can form in a state that's quite far from equilibrium. This is a requisite condition of dissipative structure to form. There has to be a non-equilibrium situation, like, for example, warm ocean water with cooler air above. That happens to be the setup for hurricanes. So what happens actually is that the warm ocean water is slowly evaporating. Molecules are leaving the surface of the water under the influence of solar energy and creating a zone that is quite wet. It's holding a lot of water. If cold air moves in over that, or if this just gets heavy and laden enough, what can happen is that a mixing event will take place if and when this moisture gathers into clouds and starts to rain. Because upon starting to rain, the water in vapor phase comes together and forms droplets in liquid phase. That releases a bunch of heat locally, which kicks the system and causes a vortex to form. In the northern hemisphere, they spin counterclockwise because of something called the Coriolis effect. That's a fine point. But what's taking place then is water driven into the air under influence of solar radiation, then coming out as precipitation, releasing enough heat to really kickstart a bunch of action. This dissipative structure moves, and one of the things we know is that when a hurricane moves from somewhat warm water to much warmer water, it tends to grow and strengthen in intensity. So this dissipative structure is measuring something about its environment and responding to it. There's adaptation to new conditions, and it goes from one state of being to another state of being. Does it have the attributes, the qualities to be called a self? I don't know. There's a lot of debate on this, and other examples too. Um, Another example would be if you're playing a flute. So I used to do that quite a bit. And if you blow a note on a flute, the sound you're getting has to do with a dissipative structure of waves of density in the air inside the tube of this flute. You're providing a gradient, a pressure gradient, because you're blowing into the top of the flute and air is traveling in and going down, and it's creating this dissipative structure which releases some of its energy in the form of sound, and we hear the musical note. Well, if you're playing a nice smooth note, say a D note, if you just tighten up your embouchure and blow a little harder so that now the pressure differential goes from here to here, that dissipative structure changes. It goes to a structure with more nodes in it. I think frequently twice as many. I have to double check that, but it takes on a tighter structure with more bumps, more zones of wave and anti-wave, or call it an anti-node and a node and an anti-node and a node. So there's this structure that changes its shape and becomes more complex, and it starts emitting the next higher note, or actually the next octave from the one that it was just doing. If you don't change your fingers, you just hold them the same, you get one octave up by driving this dissipative structure more forcefully. There's many such examples, and I think what I might do is fish up a few more of them for next time, and try to describe a little bit more about the thermodynamics that drive the formation of dissipative structures. Now, a couple minutes ago I was talking about single-cell organisms. A living single organism, single-celled organism, is absolutely a dissipative structure. It's dissipating a chemical gradient of available energy, usually in the form of glucose, but not always, that it can use to drive its inner machinery and its metabolism. And so you might already be thinking, wow, okay, cells have their own life going on. They exist in glucose, they burn it. Somehow that allows them to fuel the formation of the structure inherent to their existence. And yet we know they can mate up, and they can form aggregates, they can form tissues, they can form organisms who get together and form Theosophical lodges and societies and countries. And you're off to the races in terms of hierarchies of dissipative structures. So this actually ends up being a long and beautiful discussion shared by scientists and biologists and sociologists and economists, and it goes and goes. So the last thing I wanted to get to here is a couple of another word that is often used in this area that's kind of important is the word agency. Because we're realizing that a dissipative structure that's got a form and it's lasting and it's persisting for a while can exhibit behaviors that look very much like agency. In other words, deciding what to do in the advent of a circumstance change or an environmental change. There are ways to encode and describe agency mathematically, and it becomes one of the central points of investigation in scientists who care about this area. There's one particularly amazing scientist who I would just recommend anybody who cares about this area and wants to read ahead or listen ahead a little bit for my next talk on this. There's a fellow named Michael Levin at Tufts University in New Jersey who he's doing some amazing explorations, discovery, innovative work, and he's generalizing our ideas, both in terms of biological and even non-biological examples of agency and cognition, because right there on the heels of agency is decision and choice and problem solving. And he's pushing this at a level, and with a level of eloquence that I think you would enjoy anything you listen to from this guy. So Michael Levin, that's Levin. I'll tell you one thing he's done that this is just sort of mind-blowing, and I'll close on this. He has invented a new life form, essentially, by taking cells from either frog skin or human trachea cells and growing them in conditions where they have all the glucose they need to eat, and they are allowed to self-organize and figure out what to be. Now that they're liberated from all their friends, they're no longer part of a frog epithelium or a human tracheal matrix. And under the right conditions, he ends up being able to coax these things into forming something we might call xenobots or anthrobots. They're just little balls of cells that figure out how to stick together and use cilia to swim around and do stuff. And sometimes the stuff they do is so surprising, and it's completely divorced from whatever it was they were doing in the donor organism that they came from. So, for example, one incredible experiment he did was to grow a sheet of nervous tissue. I guess it would have been on the bottom of a petri dish or something. Get an overlying layer, a supernatant layer of anthrobots. I think it was anthrobots, meaning came from human cells. It could have been xenobots from frogs, I've forgotten now. But then scratch the nervous tissue and make a little rip in it so that what had been a nice copacetic nerve tissue network is now got a discontinuity. And what they found was, after a couple days, these little xenobots had gravitated to the point of the tear and somehow secreted hormones or chemical factors or something that allowed the nervous tissue to start healing. They acted spontaneously. You're tempted to use the word instinctively, but I think it's sub-instinctive. It's somehow just an autonomous behavior that their molecules decide to come up with that would begin to heal the rupture in this nervous tissue. Nobody had ever seen anything like that. It's a complete new world. And obviously a very exciting one from a restorative medicine point of view. This is going to catch a lot of attention and activity and research over time. And the story goes way on from there, but I think I'm out of time. So I will say good night to you, and thank you for coming, and I hope you have a great week ahead. So this is Jeff signing off.